inaugural meeting, it's a pleasure to see such a significant turnout from across the academic, policy and provider sectors. My name is Dr. Karen Watson, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands of which we meet today. I'm joining you from Dharawal country, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm joined today by some of the members of our steering committee. I have Dr. Moira Dunsmore from the University of Sydney, and we also have Dr. Janine Margarita Dizzen from Aged Care Research Industry Innovation Australia, ARIA. And we'd also like to extend a very special thanks to Dr. Rebecca Bilton from ARIA for her invaluable help and guidance in establishing this group. Unfortunately, Nicole Sutton will not be joining us today, but she does send her best regards to everyone and her best wishes. So just a little bit of information. The Australian Long-Term Care Interest Group was formed in response to growing demand from local members of the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care, providing a dedicated regional hub to collaborate on Australian care priorities at location-friendly times. Like many other countries, Australia faces growing challenges in providing care to an ageing population with increasingly complex health and social needs. Our goal is to advocate, foster critical dialogue, and promote multidisciplinary collaboration during this contemporary transformation towards a rights-based legislative framework. So we aim to provide a dedicated forum where academics, practitioners, policymakers, and consumer advocates can bridge the gap between research and reality, supporting innovations like restorative care pathways to ensure that reform is not just a regulatory requirement, but a lived experience that promotes dignity at risk for every older Australian.
So what James can do is just prepare.
We're also proud to serve as a collaborative hub and a primary point of contact for the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care, ensuring that our system is informed by international best policy and practice. Today, we're setting the scene for a system in transition. I'm going to be providing a brief strategic overview of the reform landscape before handing over to our distinguished guests who have generously agreed to join us today. Gary Raitt, the Deputy Commissioner of the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, and Natalie Siegel-Brown, the Inspector General of Aged Care. So to understand our future, we must be candid about our past. The 2021 Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety was a watershed moment that exposed systemic failures in quality, safety and respect. We were a system in crisis. Historically, older Australians faced wait times of up to 28 months for high-level home care packages. We also faced a workforce exodus, losing approximately 65,000 workers annually due to chronic low pay and limited career pathways. This burning platform made the legislative shift to the new Aged Care Act not just a policy choice, but a moral necessity to replace the provider-centric model of 1997. It is, however, important to acknowledge that managing demand remains a live issue. Even with the new supported home rollout and thousands of packages being released weekly, current 2026 data shows that there's still significant wait time for both standard priority and complex cases. The system is moving, but the queue remains a significant challenge for older Australians. This slide illustrates the key features of our system's transition and reflects a fundamental move from an activity-based system to one that is truly needs-based. We're moving away from fixed package levels to flexible individual budgets under the supported home program. Crucially, the new system introduces a $130,000 lifetime cap on care contributions, providing a financial safety net that was previously missing. And by codifying rights in the 2025 Act, we are creating a legislative foundation that Gary and Natalie will discuss shortly regarding regulation and independent oversight. In residential care, these rights are being realised through direct clinical mandates, Since July 2023, it's been mandatory to have a registered nurse on site 24/7. We've also implemented a mandatory minimum of 215 care minutes per resident per day. And to ensure these standards are upheld and transparent, the star rating system now allows consumers to compare performance of aged care homes across Australia. These interventions are designed to raise the intensity and quality of care, directly addressing the historic understaffing identified by the Royal Commission. And our final strategic priority is ageing in place. Supporting Australians to remain in their home is not only preferred by consumers, but is a more sustainable economic model for care, for the care economy. The new Support at Home program replaces the old home care packages with 8 levels of support, allowing for a much more granular assistance based on assessed need. We're also preparing for the full integration of the Commonwealth Home Support Program by mid-2027. So this sets the scene for the new legislative landscape. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Moira Dunsmore, who will introduce Gary Ray, Deputy Commissioner of the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, to discuss the rights-based approach of the new Act and the Commission's regulatory operations. Thanks, Moira.
Thanks, Karen. And I'm not sure I need to reintroduce Gary. So really delighted to have both Gary and Natalie here, both really unique perspectives on what's happening in the Australian aged care sector today. So both of you will have approximately 15 minutes to discuss your topic, and then we'll have a more moderated discussion and Q&A. We would ask that you post your questions in the chat and target those to the specific speaker, either Natalie or Gary, that you are wanting to direct the question to. And we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. So we're going to start with you, Gary. Thank you very much once again. So Gary, Deputy Commissioner for Regulatory Operations at the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission. And Gary is going to be speaking about rights-based approach of the new Act and regulatory operations. So thank you once again, and over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Karen and Moira. It's great to be able to join you at this first event. As you heard, my name is Gary Rake. I'm the Deputy Commissioner looking after regulatory operations in the Commission. The span of my part of the organisation is all of the interaction with providers. So everything from registering new providers, conducting audits for a new provider or a provider looking to renew their registration, dealing with monitoring and crises along the way. So if there was an incident at an aged care home in Bathurst, New South Wales today, my team would be on ground tomorrow morning to work with the provider to understand what had happened. And moving through to the compliance and enforcement end of things, where sometimes we do need to hold providers to account. I was going to share a couple of slides today. I think the team setup might have needed me to be an event organiser for that. They're not critical. Let's push on. And I will apologise. We've had a critical IT fail in our office today. So our entire network's down. So I'm working from my laptop on a 5G card. If my signal breaks up, could someone just sort of give me a wave to let me know, and I'll slow down. So as I said, look, a real pleasure to be here and to see a community being sort of more formally established in Australia to talk about these topics, to share that knowledge, and I'm really excited to see what comes of it. Our work as a regulator has always been a collective effort. We always have been in the habit of connecting with academic insights, joining up with our policy design colleagues, managing frontline delivery, working with providers, and all with the aim of building awareness of and protecting and maintaining the rights of older Australians. And so the communal intelligence and collective effort that we get out of that is pretty central to how we approach our role. So I hope what you'll find is as you convene future webinars, wherever we're useful and relevant, you'll find us there and willing to participate. So the role in regulatory operations, as I said, we're working alongside the sector, and our aim is to make sure that people are receiving the safe and high quality care that they deserve. We're a risk-based regulator. we're rights respecting, and that means that everything we do is grounded in those rights of the older people. In particular, what we're thinking about there is their rights to safety, to dignity, to quality of care. I like to describe our role as, for my team, it's plain English, we're the custodians of quality and safety, and we carry that responsibility on behalf of older people and the wider community who care about them. And so then as we go about our work, our two little taglines, we aim to be as fair as possible, as firm as necessary, in that order. So fairness first, and then as firm as necessary, which could be light touch or it could be a bit firmer. So the Statement of Rights, the previous aged care system was criticised pretty roundly in the Royal Commission for being too focused on the needs of providers and how to fund them, rather than the needs of the individuals receiving care. The new Aged Care Act aims to address that really directly by developing and integrating a Statement of Rights. The Statement of Rights ensures that older people and their needs are at the centre of the aged care system, and it outlines the rights that every individual holds when accessing aged care services in Australia. So just sort of summarising across those rights, it gives older people the right to make their own decisions about their life, to have their decisions not just accepted but respected, and to be able to get information to support them and help them make those decisions. They should be able to communicate their wishes, their needs, their preferences. A really important one, they should feel safe and respected. They should have their culture and their identity respected. They should be able to stay connected with their community. So for the Regulatory Operations Division in my part of the world, the Statement of Rights is an enforceable regulatory instrument, and it places really clear obligations on providers. We hope that it also gives older people and their families a shared language and a clear expectation of what good care looks like. Over time, we hope it will mean that everyone can identify when a right is not being upheld, and we know that we've got the mandate to come in and act when that isn't the case. I will just kind of share quite a horrific moment for me quite recently. In a regulatory engagement with a provider, we sought through our regulatory powers production of documents from a particular provider. And among the documents that they gave us was a paper presented to their board. It was a risk management plan, a risk matrix. And one of the risks that was identified was that older people might become aware that they have rights and seek to activate them. That's horrific. And that prompts a pretty strong response from us when we see that sort of thing. I hope that they chose their words poorly. I hope that what they were reflecting was their own vulnerabilities and that they might not be able to step up to that task. I really hope they weren't thinking about how could they hide rights and block people from pursuing their rights. It takes us into our regulatory architecture. What does it mean for how we regulate? So each of the rights links to measurable outcomes that providers must meet, and we express these as a set of strengthened standards, quality standards. These standards enable us to connect the behavioural expectations from worker through provider and join it all up with a code of conduct. Underpinning this is a legal basis on which the provider is permitted to operate. That's known as the obligations and conditions of registration. So any failure to uphold rights flows through to a failure against the standards, the code of conduct, ultimately against the conditions of registration. And that's how we move from having rights, expressing them, seeking to have them respected and fulfilled and activated, all the way through to having a regulatory accountability when we need it. We take a risk-led and proportionate approach to our regulation. And so that means we are focused on preventing issues that have a higher risk of harm. When we do that through a combination of intelligence gathering, everything from complaints, our audits, monitoring of financial and prudential operations. When we engage with providers, we're looking sort of through the incident into the ultimate cause, and that might trigger a new round of risk assessment for us. And the aim is to make sure that we're getting a complete picture of the governance, operations, systems and care within a provider. And that enables us, when we're thinking about regulatory response, to move anywhere from education all the way through to the strongest of enforcement, which might be seeking large financial penalties or removing providers from the sector altogether. Think about the practical application of rights, inclusion and cultural safety. I think it's one of the more tangible ones that I like to talk about because it shows how rights-based regulation can work in practice. The Act states that all care must be culturally safe, culturally appropriate and responsive to individual needs. And those rights don't change based on where a person lives or what their background is or their expression of culture, their expression of language, their life experience. And so the Statement of Rights specifies that an individual has that right to be treated with dignity and respect, to have safe, fair, equitable and non-discriminatory treatment, to have their identity, culture, spirituality, diversity, all valued and supported. And so when we come in from a regulatory perspective, we're not just going to look at a simple set of rules. Does an inclusion or diversity policy exist? We're going to look at whether it's embedded in practice, whether it's factored into care planning, whether staff are being supported to deliver it. And that's everything from helping staff with initial training through to giving them flexibility in the way they fulfil their roles in a service to meet that cultural care. To give you an example from a service that I visited, it was a service that provided care to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It was a very high proportion of their residents. And they also had Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander care workers. And we heard from a clinically trained female Indigenous care worker that one of the two world's challenges that she finds is that as a clinician, she can sometimes see that a man in her care needs a form of intimate care that would be culturally inappropriate for her to deliver, culturally unsafe for her to deliver it, culturally unsafe for him to deliver it. But she's the only available person there. There isn't a male clinical worker who could deliver that care. And so she finds herself faced with the challenge. My clinical being knows I must provide this care. My cultural being says I must not provide this care. Having a way to work that through. What I loved in that scenario was how the worker and the older person and their family worked it through. And they basically found a view that everyone respected that the clinical care was essential and that with a little bit of tinkering and extra interpersonal respect, they could find a way to work around what might have otherwise been a cultural barrier, and it became then both clinically safe and culturally safe. A very firm procedure couldn't have really addressed that. If we do receive a complaint around cultural safety, we don't just examine the incident. We want to know, how did the organisation set itself up to try to create a culturally safe environment? We want to know whether they considered it in the person's individual care plan, whether there was a really sincere agreement between the person and their representatives and the provider about what culturally safe care looks like. When we're thinking about the test of culturally safe care, it can only be determined by the person who is receiving care. So it's not a test that the provider can say, we ticked all of these boxes, it's done. We're going to ask the person and their family, what did they ask for? What were their needs? How was it met? It's also important for us to think about the concept of intersectionality and also how to deal with trauma. But older people don't experience their identity through a single lens. None of us do. They might be navigating different aspects of identity all at once. Culture, language, gender, sexuality, disability, past trauma. And these factors can intersect and shape how a person experiences care, how they access service, even their willingness to speak up. And the way those lived experience and personal attributes come out might change over time. A person moving into and through dementia might call back different memories of trauma and might respond in different ways than they did earlier in their life or earlier in their time in the service. So it really emphasises that we can't be taking a one-size-fits-all approach. We've got to start to build up a skill and a capability, a conversational capability, soft skills to consider the whole person, to understand the layered experiences and to think about where that might create challenges, barriers, and in the long term, opportunities for care. So then we get to how do we support people? As much as the systems and the regulation matters, so does the individual's ability to understand, express and exercise their rights. We know that most people will try to express concerns directly with their provider in the first instance, but there are barriers that we know exist, like not knowing who to speak to, or not feeling that they'll be heard, or not even knowing whether the topic in their mind, the thing that's important to them, is a topic that they're allowed to speak about. So we've got to create really safe environments where people are encouraged to speak up, invited to speak up, whether that is the older person, their family or representative, staff. We need to know that everyone that's at this interface of rights-based care knows the importance of speaking up, and that's really the only way that we turn a policy intent into a human-centric and rights-based outcome. So let's go to some good practice. When we're working with providers who are doing this well, the sort of things that we see is that they have this embedded in the conversations that they have with their consumers, even from pre-admission, even before they take the person on as a care recipient. They're talking about how the organisation approaches culturally safe care and inclusion. They flow it through to the specific care planning. It's reflected in the way a care plan is developed, the interval for review and renewal, the things that will change over a season, over a year, over the person's remaining lifetime. We find providers are reflected in their workforce capability, the way they recruit, the value proposition they put to people, the explanation about the culture that they have in the organisation, so that people can choose to work in a place that aligns with their values. And we see it in their governance processes. And what I'm really expecting there is that board members are actively asking, what is our posture on rights? How do we explain it? How can we assure ourselves that we're doing well? Or how can we go out and actively look for gaps in the way we're working? And they need to make sure that that's part of their everyday operation and be open to hearing where it could be done better. Part of our proportionate rights-based approach, if we encounter a provider that's not quite getting it right, but they're open to learning and they're open to change and they're doing that quickly, we're going to walk alongside. We're not going to pull out the big regulatory sticks. So we hope that providers sort of apply that discipline to themselves and look for their own areas of improvement. So this is a significant change. We're still in the early stages. We've got an app that's set a great framework. Now we're moving into the space where we're really looking to try and see that translated. We're part of that work. You've now come together and you're part of that work. I hope we can keep working together to see it come to life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary. That was great. And we've also got a couple of questions I can see already in the chat, but we might go to Natalie in the first instance. So Natalie Siegel-Brown is joining us. She is Inspector General of Aged Care, which is an important body providing independent oversight of the system. And Natalie's presentation today is titled From Aspiration to Action. So I think that really summarises the core theme of what we're talking about today. So Natalie, over to you, and then we'll go to questions and discussion after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Moira, and thank you to all of you for having me speak at your first meeting. It's an absolute privilege. And I just wanted to let you know that I'm coming from the lands of the Yagara Turrbal people here in Meanjin in Brisbane, and I want to acknowledge elders, community, and the spirit of the beautiful lands on which all of us are coming from, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on this webinar with us today. Karen, you very beautifully laid out for us the intention of the move from a provider-centric law to a rights-based law. And the reason the title of my presentation is From Aspiration to Action is because my role as Inspector General is to sit over the top of the entire system and ask whether we are truly delivering that in practice. So you've heard from Gary, who is the regulator for providers. I am effectively the oversight body for the government. So I sit over the top of the department that administers the legislation, over the top of the policy and programmatic design and the regulation and funding. And it's my job to comment on when it is not working as intended for older people. In fact, the wording in my Inspector General of Aged Care Act is that my job is all about holding government accountable for the continuous improvement of aged care for older people. So the question becomes whether these new theoretical concepts that we've talked about around rights-based care, person-centred care, that are now so beautifully articulated in the new Aged Care Act, for example, through things like your entitlement to connection to country and to culture and to cultural safety, to your pets, to the natural environment, to ageing in place, whether the reform implementation is actually delivering on that. And effectively, I consider my role as now testing whether the plumbing matches the poetry. So that's what I'd like to speak to you about today. So as you would all know, about 4 years ago, a report culminating from the testimony of hundreds of older people, carers, providers in this country, they told the truth about aged care as it then was. And for the first time ever, we had an inquiry of a very serious scale that actually listened to older people. And we heard stories, as you know, of neglect, of invisibility, of a system that often reduced people to tasks to be completed as opposed to lives to be lived. The Royal Commission set out a vision for total transformation. It envisaged that its final report and recommendations should deliver a system grounded in dignity, in rights, and importantly, in connection and meaning as we aged, so that we are not flattened into this medicalised body to be cared for. We are still treated as a whole person like we are and like we should be for our entire lives. It really called on this country to deliver a system where older people in Australia wouldn't merely exist, but truly live. And that's, for me, a distillation of how I see that transformation. And as we know, that ambition is no longer just a moral aspiration. It's actually codified in law. That means it can no longer be a theoretical aspiration. It is actually mandated in delivery. But that means the government has to deliver it, not just providers. So the Aged Care Act, the new Aged Care Act, embeds a rights-based framework at the centre of our system. It says very clearly that older people are entitled to care that is safe, equitable, accessible, and respectful of their dignity and choices. I will clarify, it doesn't give us all the right to aged care. It gives us all the right to be assessed for aged care, but it says that when we do receive aged care, this is what we should receive. So the question for all of us is this: have we actually truly moved from aspiration to action? And some of you may be aware that this is going to be a fairly depressing presentation, for which I'm going to try and be quite solution focused, but I am extremely concerned that the plumbing is not just matching the poetry of the Act, it's physically undermining the Act. So what has changed? Well, a lot has happened. There's no doubt there's been a lot of significant reform activity, new legislation, new programs, new funding models, new structures. And it would be unreasonable and, frankly, unfair to suggest that nothing has changed. And as you know, reform of this scale is never going to be simple. It's never going to be quick. But the truth that we have to sit with is activity is not the same as transformation. And my office was very explicit in our last report on the government's implementation of the Royal Commission recommendations, is that we have this, I'll call it a flurry, but it's almost furious level of activity, but no theory of change that said, hang on, if this is indeed the aspiration we are now going to mandate in law, how do we work backwards from that to think about the incentives and disincentives we need to re-gear in the system? My concern is that perhaps what we've done is institute a raft of isolated, disconnected reforms that bump into each other, and indeed we might be increasing our focus on outputs and tasks and recording of tasks at the expense of the actual relational experience that we're promising within the Act itself. Because when you step back and you look across the system, and more importantly, when I listen to the hundreds of older people and their experiences, I feel like a different picture is emerging. And it's the central challenge of the reform agenda. The ambition of the Act is right, the values are right. Arguably, the architecture of the legislation is mostly right. If somebody flew in from outer space and read the Act, they'd be like, oh, yep, this looks like it's got all the recipe for the good stuff. But as I mentioned, the plumbing doesn't match that. And it, in fact, undermines it in so many places. Now, the argument that I often hear is that it's too expensive to truly deliver the ageing in place promised by the Act. It's too expensive to deliver the compassion, the connection, and the meaning that the Act sets out as fundamental rights in your access to care. We have a rights-based Act sitting over the top of a system that still behaves in transactional, fragmented, and at times inaccessible ways. And I don't want you to think that this is me saying all providers bad. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is we haven't thought carefully about how we needed to flip the system we had as opposed to tweak it at the edges to deliver on this vision. And I think where this matters most is inequity. The gaps play out across the system, but it's most visible and most consequential when we look at equity, because a rights-based system is not a system that works well for most people. It really is a system that works for everyone, and particularly for those who have the most to lose if it doesn't. So I think equity is where the system either holds or fails. So let's think about if we're just thinking about long-term care in the home. Ultimately, surely our aspiration is to reduce reliance on institutional care. If you read the Act, surely that's the logical consequence. And if you listen to ministers, we're constantly hearing this cry of we'll never have enough beds. Surely we need to be thinking about how we are keeping people home and independent for longer, not just as an economic imperative, but it is now a legal imperative. So for many people, the ability to access that home care is challenged by their socioeconomic status. Let's remember that 3/4 of the people who access support at home are part of full pensioners. But also there are many people for whom this system carries a completely different weight. For those who grew up in institutions, who were subject to government interventions that remove them from their family as children, for those we know as the forgotten Australians or care leavers, aged care is not just another service. For those who have often been at the mercy of government oppression in countries from which they have migrated as refugees, aged care is not just another service. Interaction with the aged care assessment system is not just a process. It can feel like returning to something they spent a lifetime trying to escape. What they need is not just access. What they need is trauma-aware, healing-informed care that restores choice and control, care that ensures they're never made to feel powerless or invisible again. And I'm not just saying that as rhetoric or abstract sentiment. That promise, what I just said there, that's actually codified in the Act, their rights, but in practice, they are not delivered as protections. They are currently unmet promises. And when we have systems that remain rigid, transactional and controlling, we're not just falling short. I think that we are at very serious risk of re-triggering trauma and replicating the very harms the reforms were meant to address. And when we look at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's access to the aged care system and experience of the aged care system, the challenge is just as clear, but also completely unaddressed. The government has not touched a single one of the recommendations relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of the Royal Commission. And as a result, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders are being mainstreamed into a system that is causing harm, a harm that was warned of by the Royal Commission and a harm that was accepted and the recommendations following that agreed to by government. So the Royal Commission didn't call for incremental improvement within the existing system for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It actually called for something fundamentally different. It called for a separate aged care pathway co-designed with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that is grounded in cultural safety, trauma-aware and healing-informed, supports connection to country and culture, and delivered through strong community-controlled organisation. That was what was envisaged. That was what was accepted by government, but no work has commenced on this. And some may argue the point and say, oh, but we've commissioned Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander assessment services. There are 3 services run by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled organisations that are forced to run according to the mainstream system. The separate pathway has not been realised. There is no commitment still, 4 years later, to a genuine co-designed end-to-end aged care model. Instead, we're just seeing a move towards mainstreaming. And importantly, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander survivors of the stolen generation, which is almost a quarter now of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people over the age of 50, if you have received a redress payment, a payment made as an apology by a state or territory government for the harm you've suffered, you're effectively penalised for that apology payment because that redress payment will not be exempted from the means testing for your receipt of home care. It is now for residential care, but not for home care, which is where the majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders want to receive their care. On the other side of it, we know what works. Community-controlled organisations delivering care, that's holistic. We know that works. And that doesn't just work for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, it works for our many and diverse, culturally and linguistically diverse communities as well. It's care that recognises social, emotional and spiritual well-being as central, not as peripheral, not as something that should be charged as the most expensive nice to have, which if you look at the supported home model, that spiritual, cultural, kin care stuff is the stuff that even for a pensioner attracts a 17.5% copayment. It is the most expensive category of copayment. So again, we see that same pattern. The ambition is right, the model is not. The system is not aligning with what we promised, and in some cases it's contradicting it. So what I think this tells us is that if the system doesn't work well for the general population, we can be certain it works even less well for those who face additional barriers. And unfortunately, my inbox and my lived experience groups, I am hearing challenge after challenge, but also I'm hearing stories where older people say to me, this approach doesn't seem logical at the economic end of things to me. And that brings me to the false economy of ignoring rights and equity. We often hear tacitly through the signals of the system that the ambition of the Royal Commission, a system that delivers ease of access, equity of access, connection and meaning in your ageing journey, connection and meaning also being things that amongst our audience today you would well know prevent frailty and decline. Those things are considered simply too hard or too expensive to deliver. And I think we've got things the wrong way around here, because in reality, it's that very ambition, that human rights ambition, that ageing in place, that is actually not just a moral strategy or sentiment, it's actually fiscal strategy. It's an ambition that makes the system sustainable. So when people access care early, when they're not on wait lists that go for up to a year, and we're hearing that's about the median wait for many services at home at the moment, when people access care early, they deteriorate less. When they're supported to stay at home, we avoid far more expensive interventions. That's economic logic. It's not just compassion. So right now, I think the way we distribute our aged care budget is telling a very particular ideological story that is at odds with the Act. It says we're far better at responding late than supporting early. We're better at paying for dependence than investing in independence. And you can see the consequences of that. People don't enter the aged care system early. So when I say they don't enter it early, the aged care system, of course, covers more than just residential aged care. Most people are using CHSP or supported home, well over the majority. And when they do, they arrive in the system after having waited a long time, they're exhausted, their health has deteriorated and their choices have narrowed. And not because they didn't want help, but because the system actually makes early engagement hard, confusing and intimidating. and my office wrote a review on my aged care and accessing that maze of a system. That all contributes to that. So by the time people are reaching those levels of care, they're dealing with complexity that could have been avoided with earlier and much simpler support. And this is where I think the economics and the humanity quotient converge. We already know across health, disability, and ageing that timely, low-level support and connection delays the need for high-cost care. Yet our system remains structurally weighted toward late-stage intervention and crisis response. So what you can hear I'm saying here is, when I hear this cry from government of, we'll never have enough money, look, we'd have to build a new residential aged care facility every 3 days, I would argue that we are not using our $40 billion wisely. When people have to wait 3 months or 12 months for essential supports that would keep them at home now, when we make them wait, we think in government terms that we're managing the budget in the short term, but actually those people don't leave the system. They come back shortly after in much greater crisis, and offer the small amount we could have paid to keep them at home will now cost us that average of $115,000 odd per year in residential aged care. So even if we leave the hospital interface out of this, from what we can see, there appears to be a case where, because people are missing out on supports early, they're entering residential care either unnecessarily or earlier than they need to, which is costing the system more. And my office is currently doing a piece of work, a large economic piece of work to demonstrate that. In parallel with that, we have administrative processes which are costing the system a lot of money. And if you'll bear with me for one example, one of the older people that is on one of our lived experience groups mentioned to me, and I'll explain why this is not just one isolated example in a moment, she needed a $50 pair of crutches. She is a full pensioner and therefore could not afford to pay the $50 that week without it coming at the expense of electricity or food that week. When she went through the support at home system, she was told that the fact that her GP had recommended she needed that set of crutches to stay at home independently was insufficient. They needed an occupational therapist to test whether the GP was right. Therefore, this would actually cost $1,800 out of her package, and she would have to wait 3 months. $1,800. Now, while that's coming out of her package, that's government funding, that's 36 times what it would cost just to fund the crutches. In addition, the 3 months she waits puts her at risk of a fall, which is, as we know, one of the greatest risk factors to going into residential aged care, which costs a heck of a lot more than $50 to the government. When I have raised this example previously, I have had so many people come up to me, providers, older people, and want to give me stories that replicate that. The assistive technology sector, who provide these mobility aids, have said to me they have never been busier quoting in all their lives, yet it's not flowing through the delivery of goods to older people. That assistive technology sector supplies your mobility beds, your bed lifts, your mobility chairs, all the things that actually help people age in place, like the Act promises. So when we talk about reform, this is not just about improving the system, it's actually about redesigning it around what we already know works. Because prevention, aging in place and connection, they're not the cost of the system, they're actually what make it viable. So I think we're at risk of something quite subtle but quite dangerous. I think we're at risk of starting to treat the ambition of the Act as optional and treating it as too expensive to breathe life into. When I think, in fact, it gives the recipe to a sustainable budget in the face of rhetoric that the budget is insatiable. So I'm hearing this rhetoric that the budget is insatiable for an ageing population. I think we're at risk of reforms becoming a series of program changes rather than the transformation it was intended to be. And perhaps most concerningly, I think we're at risk of normalising the gap between what the law promises and what people actually experience. I think ageing in place, prevention and rights as the foundation of the system are not just how we meet the law. This is my attempt at not being depressing, by the way. but I actually think they answer the looming economic challenges that seem to be the government's perennial lament too. I apologise, that was probably a lot more than 20 minutes.
Natalie, thank you so much for that. Really inspiring to hear both the presentations. And we do actually have quite a number of questions in the chat. So I might start off just with a fairly broad question and direct it to both of you. Natalie, we'll give you time to have a drink. So I might direct this one to Gary first before asking you the same. If we fast forward the system, and maybe 12 months is being a little bit aspirational on my part, but if we fast forward 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, what would success look like to both of you in terms of the rights-based aged care system becoming a reality rather than just rhetorical? So Gary, over to you, the first instance.
I am an extremely practical person, and so I'm going to think straight about I'll think about a residential care facility first, but this should also hold in home support, that I could go into a facility, that I could knock on the door of any room, and if welcomed in, I could ask the older person or their family about their experience, and that they'd say something like, this place asks me about me, they ask me about what's important to me, and my services end up being the things that are important to me. And I think if we could get it to that, and I sometimes hear at the edges of that, but I often hear a lot of gaps, except for, or they didn't ask about, or they didn't know. And so I think if we aimed for that plain English and scale of improvement, and that's something that any worker could contribute to. They don't need a special qualification to, there's no certificate in love and care. And so if we were able to get to that, I'd be pretty happy.
Thanks, Gary. Natalie, what do you think?
Beautiful, Gary. God, love to hear a regulator using the words love and care, especially one that's come from the building industry. Makes me very happy, Gary. For me, the KPIs would be measured in the felt experience of older people. But what I would want to see is that we are not measuring ourselves in terms of care minutes or outputs, or a gardener who has to take a photo every 15 minutes of what they've completed. It would be relational. It would be people having a meaningful aging journey. It would mean frailty and decline has been reduced. But I think that what we should see is that the rate, and I hate using this term, the flow rate of people coming to residential aged care is less. The stay in residential aged care is less. And forgive me for being a little bit maverick, but if I was to translate the ambitions of the Act into actually where we should be, I think deinstitutionalised care is ultimately going to prevent a lot of harm as well. Now, it's not that there aren't risks in settings where people don't have eyes on them either, but we would be physically construing and interpreting care as much more than just the physical. At the moment, I see a raft of barriers to the relational care that Gary talked about, not in the way the ACQSC regulates, but in the law itself, in these aged care rules and the way compliance has become a transactional focus.
Thank you.
Moira,
Gary.
Yep. I was just going to, if I may jump back in, and Natalie is right to sort of call me up on the need to put some substance behind things. I'm kind of picking out David Wright Howie's question about how might we measure improvements in cultural safety. There's a really interesting opportunity ahead of us. Recommendation 48 in the Royal Commission deals with cultural safety with a particular focus for First Nations communities, First Nations older people. NATSIFAC sorry, not NATSIAC, NATSIAC, I'm going to get all my acronyms wrong, the peak body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander aged care, released a report last week highlighting where progress has fallen well behind, it hasn't even started, on key recommendations that are important for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander older people. One of them goes to recommendation 48, and they're saying that we should aim to embed measurable cultural safety framework into aged care. That's a project that I think the Commission could take up in partnership with NATSIAC, in partnership with the sector. We don't need further government endorsement for that. There'll be parts of the system we can't control, but I'm always interested in what can I control, and if I can control 10%, well then let's get that 10% done. So I hope that that's one we'll be able to lean into pretty actively over the next little while. If we can come up with a measurable framework that deals with First Nations cultural safety, we'll have the great bones of one that can go with broader cultural safety for everyone and whatever that means for them.
Thanks, Gary, and I hope that's answered your question, David. Were you going to speak? Yep, carry on, please.
Thanks, Gary. My question was broader, but I see where you weaved it in at the end there. I am looking for a broader set of metrics about how the whole system is travelling on culture change, because we've got rights for culture change. And how do we get a sense as a whole how we're progressing? That was really my question.
Yeah. It's a great question, and we've got a bunch of great minds here, so let's crowdsource some answers. If people have suggestions or they've seen frameworks, hit me up direct.
And maybe I can add to your question there, David. I think that's a weight of responsibility that my office should carry, right? Which is to stand back, zoom out and say, have we changed the culture of the system? And in my report last year, I was very clear that the culture of the system hasn't changed. We've tweaked at the margins. In a lot of ways, the tweaking has just created more flurry of activity. We haven't actually shifted the culture. So we've got yet another review of the government's implementation of the Aged Care Royal Commission's recommendations. And again, it's not intended to be a tick scorecard against implementation of 148 recs. The whole idea is to zoom out and go, well, have we actually shifted here? So we're currently working with the Department of Treasury's Australian Centre for Evaluation to actually come up with a review framework which tries to drill into those things specifically, because from where we sat with the last report, it was very clear there hasn't been the shift, at least within the government's administration of the care. And we hear a provider sector actually, and an advocacy sector that's very hungry for change, hungry to implement innovation in the main.
Thanks, Natalie. And I might take the first question. We're actually running out of time, surprisingly. We've got about 7 minutes left. So I might go to Lee Fei Lau's first question about cultural safety. So we work with multicultural communities, and we know that many older people from these communities don't use websites and prefer not to read English language material. And some don't like reading in their preferred language. Most of the older people we talk to don't know that they have aged care rights and wouldn't think to complain. Culturally, it might not be something they do or know how to complain or want to go through the effort of complaining. So how does the Commission hear about those culturally unsafe care incidents in people from multicultural groups? And we might have to make that the last question.
So basically we use every tool in the kit, and we're still looking for more. So the first one is to make sure that as many people as possible know that they have rights, including the right to complain or seek help. So we'll go out to community organisations, community events, produce materials in as many languages as we can, use local verbal translators to help. So for those who don't want to even read material, we'll engage verbally. And then same at the complaint end, to try to have information about how to make a complaint out there in multiple languages, shared through community events, shared through social media and other forums, to get to maybe family members who can help support the older person. Let's think about the broader community. Who else can speak up? And then at our end, to make sure that we've got practical translation services and an outcome-based focus when we're trying to deal with a complaint. It's kind of resolution and regulation. Resolution of the complaint whenever we can, and then regulation to try and stop it happening again.
Yep. Natalie.
That it's a great question, and I guess this reaches into the heart of something we raised last year and continue to raise. A rights-based system, it should not actually rest on complaints alone. If you require complaints to be, if you are reliant on that as your only mechanism to give life to complaints, it's a little bit lip servicey, if I can say that, because it relies on people to have the self-efficacy and the self-advocacy and no fear of retribution. So it can't be just left to the regulator to be the enforcer once breach has occurred. We need to be thinking about how we've incentivised and disincentivised rights right through from the policy administration and the funding administration all the way through the system. And if you look across the world and across other care systems, it's never wholly dependent on just a complaint system to prosecute breach.
Yep. Thank you. We've got a couple of minutes left before we conclude. So if there's any questions that people would like to raise, please raise your hand. I do notice that Simon Buttery is here from King's Fund in the UK. I don't know if you're still here, Simon. Maybe not.
I am with you, but I might even be able to put myself on camera. Who knows? Yes, I am with you, although I have a very dodgy Wi-Fi connection. And the question, I was just really interested in essentially how you characterise the differences between the NDIS system and the aged care system, and whether there's any learning from the introduction of the NDIS that you will want to apply in the aged care system.
Thank you. You've probably got 1 minute each, and then I'll have to tie it all together.
Go, Nat.
I love that question because it brings me to something that I think we're struggling with in this country. I am no economist. I'm a lawyer by trade, and everything I have in economics has come from being a commissioner at the Productivity Commission by osmosis, working with an agency full of economists. But what I can hear is that the government speaks of the aged care system sometimes as a market. Sometimes they call it a sector. And other times in closed conversations, I hear them referring to comparisons with the NDIS, which is technically meant to be an insurance scheme. And I'm not sure that we've worked out which one of those things the aged care system is. There are things that have actually worked wonderfully in the insurance scheme where we don't yet completely talk about a capped amount of money, but I can see that there are things that there are safeguards around dollars that they are trying to bring in from NDIS into aged care. I'm not going to assert this, but I am just going to pop this out there as a wondering. I am wondering whether the funds administration and the policy approach we've taken to administering aged care is actually a Frankenstein of a block funded sector, which is what CHSP is, an insurance scheme, and a market-based approach. And I think we need to actually be very definite about which one it is, because otherwise we're going to end up with a melange of stuff that doesn't work.
Thank you. Gary, final word.
I am an economist, and I'll say Nat's explanation is exactly right. And if we look at where there are a couple of key differences, the NDIS as an insurance scheme allows unregistered, unregulated providers to operate as though it's a market. So even there, they've mixed two concepts. And then flip side, we're talking about probably a government-supported service scheme, but with heavy regulation on providers. So we've kind of mixed our concepts a little bit there, so it can't quite work as an efficient market. So having that policy clarity, what are we trying to set up? How do we expect it to work? What do we expect the tensions, the levers, the rules to be? That would help us.
Lovely.
Academics, pile on.
Thank you.
I can see my predecessor at the commission's also on the line. Mike Woods might have had something to say about that too.
Well, unfortunately, we've only got a minute to go, so I'm just going to wrap up here and say a big thank you to both Gary Rake and Natalie Siegel-Brown for these fantastic presentations. A reminder that we'd love you to join our group, the Australian Long-Term Care Interest Group, which is part of the Global Observatory, and we will be using the questions in the chat and some of the discussion to really think about what our next webinar would look like. So please feel free to let us know if there's issues that you want to discuss. But I think we've got off to a really good start today with Natalie and Gary's and Karen's presentations. So thank you once again for joining us. It's been really informative. Thank you.